He stood there, a 14-year-old black boy in a crisp white shirt and khaki pants, clutching a small suitcase like it was armor. "This seat isn't for you," the flight attendant snapped, not bothering to check his ticket. Her hand didn't point at the aisle. It pointed at humiliation. The cabin fell silent as he moved toward the back. No one spoke. No one stopped her. But 7 minutes later, the airline would halt operations worldwide, and no one on that flight, especially her, would ever forget his name. Malcolm Brooks clutched the handle of his compact suitcase with one hand and his boarding pass with the other, his polished brown shoes clicking softly against the jet bridge floor. The terminal behind him was a blur of noise and light, but as he stepped into the aircraft, a new atmosphere surrounded him. Pressurized silence, crisp air conditioning, and the faint scent of lemon cleaner mixed with expensive perfume. He was dressed neatly in a buttoned white shirt tucked into tan khakis, his collar pressed, his shoelaces tight. His mother had insisted he wear something respectable for his first solo flight, a cross-country trip to visit his father in D.C. "Look like you belong," she'd said. Malcolm smiled at the memory. He did belong. His father had paid an extra for him to fly first class, something he almost couldn't believe until he saw his seat printed clearly on the boarding pass, 1A. As he entered the first-class cabin, Malcolm scanned for the seat. There it was, by the window, bathed in sunlight, sleek leather cushion waiting just for him. The pod looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. His heart thudded with excitement. He stepped carefully into the row, gently placed his suitcase into the overhead bin, slid into the wide seat, and ran his hand along the cool armrest. He reached into his backpack, pulled out a dog-eared sketch pad, and began flipping to a half-finished drawing of a solar-powered monorail. His fingers itched to finish it. Then, from behind, came the sound of heels, deliberate, clipped, and fast. "Excuse me," said a sharp voice, cutting through the hum of boarding. Malcolm looked up. A woman stood in the aisle, early 50s, platinum blonde hair in a severe bun, the kind of presence that made air feel thinner. It was the lead flight attendant. Her name tag read Deborah Langston. Her eyes didn't meet Malcolm's. They scanned the seat number, then scanned him, down his neat shirt, past his pressed pants, to his brown skin and nervously clenched hands. She didn't ask a question. She didn't check his ticket. She didn't smile. Her index finger raised, arms stiff, eyes colder than steel, and pointed straight behind him. "Sir," she said, voice clipped, "please move to the back." Malcolm blinked. Sorry," he said, confused, lifting his ticket slightly. "Economy begins at row 7. You'll need to relocate. Now." He didn't understand. He had seat 1A. He'd checked it twice. His father had confirmed the reservation. Why wasn't she looking? "I think there's a mistake," Malcolm started, but Deborah cut him off. "We don't have time for this. Please move. You're holding up boarding." The words landed like stones. People around them stirred. A man in 1C lowered his newspaper slightly. A woman across the aisle glanced up over her tablet, then quickly looked away. No one said anything. No one intervened. Malcolm felt the heat climb up the back of his neck. He looked down at the boarding pass again. 1A. The ink hadn't changed, but the moment had. "Do you want me to call the gate agent?" Deborah's voice was still low, but sharp with implication, as if he was causing a disruption, as if he was out of place. Malcolm's hands trembled slightly. His eyes met hers, silently pleading, but her expression didn't shift. There was no room for reason in her eyes, only rules, or the illusion of them. He closed his sketchbook, slipped it into his backpack, rose from the seat, movements slow and deliberate, as if each one weighed 50 pounds. The pod, the view, the dream of drawing next to clouds, it all vanished in a heartbeat. He pulled his suitcase back down from the overhead bin, careful not to bump anyone, though no one offered to help. And then the walk. 16 rows. He walked past polished shoes, glass flutes of champagne, leather briefcases. Past people who watched him and those who pretended not to. His heart pounded in his ears. He didn't know which was worse, the few sympathetic glances or the complete indifference. He passed the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane, passed into a narrower aisle, tighter seats, louder air. Row 17, the last row before the lavatories. He found seat F, middle seat, wedged between an armrest hog and the humming engine wall. A crying baby shrieked 2 rows up. The window was scratched and fogged. He could barely see out. Malcolm slid in, backpack on his lap. The smell was different back here. Bleach, sweat, recycled dreams. He stared straight ahead. 1 minute passed. Then another. His chest felt tight. He pulled out his phone and held it low, below the seat line. There was still signal, barely. He opened a locked folder. 1 message thread. He typed 2 words. Clause 9 black, send. The signal flickered, then vanished. Malcolm exhaled slowly. He zipped up his backpack, closed his eyes. Somewhere, far above this plane and far beneath its systems, he had just pressed a button most people didn't know existed. And if they thought moving him to the back of the plane was the end of the story, they were about to learn who they'd really seated in 1A. The seat smelled faintly of ammonia and desperation. Malcolm leaned back in 17F, the very last row before the lavatory. The wall behind his seat vibrated every few seconds with a dull mechanical hum. Pumps, gears, whatever it was that kept the plane functioning. It was the part of the aircraft where sounds didn't fade but echoed. The flush of toilets, the hiss of air vents, the occasional clang of the service cart. The armrest on his right didn't lift, jammed in place. On his left, a man in his mid-30s had already fallen asleep, arms folded, mouth open. He was slightly over the armrest line, but Malcolm didn't dare shift or nudge. The last thing he wanted was to disturb anyone again. He pulled his backpack up into his lap and rested his chin on it. It was soft and familiar, canvas, with a stitched patch from a science camp he'd attended the summer before. He breathed in the faint scent of pencils and pages. His sketchbook sat quietly inside. He didn't pull it out. There was no point. Not now. Every bounce of the service cart, every cough, every shifting body in a nearby seat reminded him he wasn't supposed to be here. Or rather, someone had decided he wasn't. The distance between seat 1A and seat 17F was maybe 30 feet, but it felt like a chasm. A fall from grace. Not in class or cost, but in dignity. He closed his eyes. His father's voice came to him, not loud, not angry, just steady. They'll try to shrink you, son. Try to fold you up into the smallest version of yourself. But your dignity is not something they can steal. They have to wait for you to give it up. Malcolm squeezed his eyes tighter, jaw clenched. He wasn't going to give it up, not yet. He reached into the front pocket of his backpack and pulled out his phone. Still no service. The little plane icon hovered in the corner of the screen. The message was sent. 2 words. Clause 9 black. He stared at them in the sent box, even though the signal had dropped right after. He didn't know if it went through. He didn't know if his father had seen it, or what it would trigger. His dad had explained it once on a quiet drive home from school. This clause, he'd said, is not about danger to your body. It's about danger to your spirit. Malcolm hadn't understood then, but he understood now. He didn't expect his dad to storm the plane or sue the airline. That wasn't how his father worked. Harrison Brooks was a quiet man with a terrifying amount of influence. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. The world moved when he nodded. But even with that knowledge, even with that tiny hope glimmering in his chest, Malcolm still felt alone. The woman in 16E glanced back at him for a second, her lips tight. Her eyes quickly returned to the in-flight magazine. She wasn't interested in conversation or confrontation. Across the aisle, a toddler wailed, kicking the seat in front of him. A man sighed dramatically and pressed his call button. Malcolm leaned against the wall and tried to disappear into the white noise of it all. The toilet behind him flushed again. His mind drifted. What would have happened if he hadn't moved? Would they have called security? Would they have accused him of being aggressive, disruptive, uncivil? He knew what would have happened. Not in detail, but in tone. The situation would have escalated, and he would have become the problem, not the person who judged him the moment she saw his skin. He'd done what was safest, what was taught, what history had taught his family. Survive first, speak later. Still, the shame clung to him like static. The memory of walking past the curtain, past the smirks, the avoidant eyes. It looped in his mind on repeat. He pulled out his sketchbook, not to draw, just to feel the cover. It was black leather, scuffed at the corners, a gift from his dad when he turned 10. On the inside cover was a quote written in his father's precise handwriting. "Create the world that won't make room for you." Malcolm's fingers trembled slightly as he traced the letters. Was this it? Was this how he would begin? He didn't even notice the faint sound from the front cabin. A pause in the boarding process, a soft argument between staff. He didn't see the pilot glance toward the cabin, confusion lining his brow. Malcolm sat still, not because he was calm, but because he had to be. Because even in this confined, recycled airspace, where proximity didn't mean equality, he could still choose one thing: to wait. And wait he did. For something. For anything. The office sat 40 stories above the rush of Washington, D.C., sealed in silence and sunlight. Polished obsidian floors. Walls lined with screens, not windows. A single long desk stretched the length of the room, split in half by a glowing interface. This was where the flow of money was monitored. Not counted, not debated. Controlled. At the far end stood Harrison Brooks. 6 feet tall, crisp black suit. No tie. He was a man who exhaled precision. Not one detail out of place, not one emotion wasted. He wasn't talking. He never talked much. But the people around him were silent. That was how you knew something was happening. The ping came at 2:14 p.m. Eastern. A message on his private channel, one accessible by only one person in the world. Clause 9. Black. Harrison didn't blink. He didn't ask a question. He didn't confirm. He tapped his ring twice against the surface of the desk. A biometric lock disengaged with a soft chime. The interface came alive, displaying a pulsing web of real-time financial data, transaction streams, authorizations, currency corridors. His fingers danced once across the controls. Command: freeze channel 4A. Target: AstroJet financial flow. Status: initiated. Instantly, red ripples spread across the map. Every transaction thread marked with AstroJet's codes began to freeze. Fuel contracts, catering payments, landing fee transfers, third-party booking integrations. The airline's heartbeat didn't just slow, it stopped. In the background, a man in a gray blazer, the director of protocol security, leaned forward. "Confirming system-level lockout," he said, barely containing surprise. "All AstroJet gateways now on hold." Harrison finally spoke. "One plane. Flight 41 seen. Check the manifest." The director began typing furiously. Across the room, a third monitor lit up with details. Passenger logs, seat assignments. Row 1A, Malcolm Brooks. Seat 17F, Malcolm Brooks. Row 1A now occupied by... not available. Harrison didn't flinch, but his eyes sharpened. "Find the name in 1A now," he said. Seconds passed. Then 1A reassigned to internal ops override. Langston, Deborah. A muscle moved in Harrison's jaw. Barely. Cross-reference Langston with internal grievance records. Search incident tags involving underage passengers. The assistant hesitated. "Sir, we..." "Run it." A pause. "Langston has 3 prior warnings. 1 sealed reprimand from 2018. Racial bias training mandated. No follow-up logged." Harrison inhaled once. deep and slow. Pull her supervisor's ID and the gate agent. In another moment, those names were on the screen, tethered like liabilities in a ledger. Then came the twist. Not a warning light, not a problem, but a memory. 3 months ago, Harrison had sat across from AstroJet's CEO, Nathan Rudd, in a private lunch suite at the Federal Aviation Conference. Harrison had given a clear warning. "You need to audit your internal protocols," he'd said, voice calm. "Your frontline discretion policies leave room for personal bias. That's dangerous and expensive." Rudd had chuckled. "You've got to trust the people running your flights, Harrison. No system's perfect, and no one sues over seat reassignments." Harrison had nodded, then said nothing. He didn't need to, but now he remembered that moment, that arrogance, that dismissal. It wasn't just about his son anymore. It was about a warning ignored. He tapped into the executive contact thread. Rudd's number was already queued. He didn't call it. Instead, he opened the legal response suite. To his right, a tall woman in navy blue had entered the room without being announced. Celine Marshall, his general counsel, moved like a shadow. She carried a tablet, already displaying a contract template. Clause 417, non-discrimination and equal treatment terms, breach confirmed by manifest override. She didn't wait for a reply. "I'll alert the Department of Transportation's oversight liaison and send a signal to Treasury's compliance watchdogs. AstroJet's liquidity reporting will be questioned within the hour." Harrison nodded. "You'll get pushback," she added. "I want escalation logged. Every step." "Understood." She paused. "Do you want to speak to Rudd directly?" "No." There was no anger in his voice, only calculation. He turned to the director again. "Start scraping their CRM logs. I want to know who authorized the override. If there's a deeper signature, find it." "You think this was deliberate?" "I think someone used my son to send a message. Now I'll return it." Across the interface, more nodes turned red. Vendor accounts, subscription modules, loyalty program balances. Harrison watched the entire empire ripple and falter, and he didn't blink. The bridge was AstroJet's crown jewel. Housed in a sleek glass tower just outside Dallas, the Global Operations Center was built to mimic the feel of a NASA mission control room. Rows of illuminated terminals, massive real-time dashboards stretching from floor to ceiling, and a war room layout meant to keep global flight operations running seamlessly. It was here that every takeoff, every landing, every fuel run, crew shift, gate swap, and weather delay was monitored and solved in real time. It was also where the airline's invincibility lived. Until 2:18 p.m. Eastern. "Sir, we've got a delay spike," said a technician seated at the bookings console. His tone was casual at first, eyes flicking across his monitor. A supervisor named Carl Barrett walked over, sipping coffee. "Another JFK weather backup?" "No, not weather. Payments aren't clearing. I'm getting transaction rejections from gate assignments at LaGuardia, ATL, and O'Hare." Carl lowered his coffee. "Expand it." The technician tapped a few keys. Across the dashboard, bright green lines representing thousands of real-time payments, fuel costs, flight meal orders, foreign landing fees, began flickering orange, then red. Then, like a virus spreading from the heart, every major operational node across the map went dark. Carl stared. "What the hell?" "Sir!" another voice shouted from the finance quadrant. "Credit processing's locked. Vendor payments are bouncing." "Ground fuel teams in Miami and LAX just reported invoices declined," said a third. "They're halting truck rolls." Across the room, more alerts chimed in. "Flight 407 is stuck at gate C7. JFK Tower says clearance isn't processing in the system. Booking API's down. Front-end ticketing is frozen. Mobile apps failing hard." Within 90 seconds, the bridge, a place designed to absorb chaos, became the eye of it. All eyes turned to the center screen where a red error pulse now blinked in sync across all channels. One word appeared in bold white font. "Frozen." Carl nearly dropped his cup. "What's the route?" a woman at the back replied. voice tight. "OmniFlow Channel 4A. Central Processing Gateway is blocking all AstroJet traffic. Hard lock." "Override it." "We can't. It's not internal. It's upstream. We're locked out from the outside." Carl's face drained of color. "Get legal. Get tech. Get everyone." Across the world, 139 AstroJet planes sat idle at gates, unable to push back. Another 17 hovered mid-air, approaching international destinations where unpaid landing fees now meant being denied clearance to descend. Passengers began flooding social media with questions. Agents at terminals had no answers. News tickers began scrolling erratically. AstroJet flight delays spike across US, no official cause cited. And still, in first class, on Flight 417, Deborah Langston adjusted her blazer and smiled. She felt good. She'd done what needed to be done. The boy had moved without incident. She'd reasserted the unspoken order of the cabin, the sanctity of decorum, of expectations. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't embarrassed him. She'd simply nudged him back into his rightful place. Now, with all passengers boarded and the plane sealed, she was mentally preparing her service plan. Champagne to rows 1 through 3, water or soda to economy, a smooth start to a 6-hour cross-country trip. She had no idea that the plane's engines were still silent, or that the pilot was quietly fuming in the cockpit, or that the company she'd served for 24 years was collapsing, one silent financial circuit at a time. In the cockpit, Captain Elliot Reeves stared at his display. Every checklist was green. Every light was normal, except one. "Departure clearance, still pending," he said, tapping the screen. "What's going on down there?" His co-pilot frowned. "Ops says the payment processing failed. Clearance hold is system-wide." "System-wide?" "That's what they said," Elliot swore under his breath. Who the hell forgets to pay clearance channels? But it wasn't forgetfulness. It was precision, surgical. Back at the bridge, Carl was now on the line with legal counsel, his forehead slick with sweat. "You're telling me OmniPay did this deliberately?" The attorney on the other end sounded grim. "Yes. We just got confirmation. Clause 417 was invoked. Breach of service agreement. Financial ethics violation." Carl's mouth went dry. "But that clause has never been used." "What kind of breach?" There was silence. Then, "They're citing discriminatory treatment of a minor passenger on Flight 417, first class." Carl blinked. "What?" Across the room, his eyes found the blinking ID of the delayed aircraft. 417, JFK to LAX. The screen pulsed red. He knew instinctively that this wasn't a mistake. It was retribution. The system hadn't glitched. It hadn't failed. It had been shut off, not by hackers, not by accident, but by someone who knew exactly where to strike. Someone whose child had just been humiliated on AstroJet's most high-profile route. And 5 minutes after that child had moved seats, the whole system followed him, down. Lucien West sat in his private office, 12 floors above AstroJet's public headquarters, sipping espresso from a ceramic mug that bore no logo. The room was dim, by design. Floor-to-ceiling blackout shades drawn despite the Texas sun. Walls lined with matte black shelving. No awards, no degrees. Only a single framed photo sat on his desk. A chessboard, mid-match. One black knight remaining. He was watching the chaos unfold in real time on his secured terminal. Flight delays, fuel holds, systems offline. He didn't panic. In fact, he smiled. Lucien had worked in aerospace logistics and internal compliance for nearly 20 years. Most people had no idea he was back at AstroJet. His return had been quiet, facilitated by a strategic acquisition and a reshuffling of titles. Director of Ops and Ethics Integration sounded important but vague enough not to raise flags. And that's how Lucien preferred it. Because Lucien didn't just operate systems, he designed the cracks in them. He had seen Deborah's cabin report 30 minutes earlier. A seat reassignment flagged as non-compliant passenger behavior but lacking escalation. No security call, no physical resistance, just one note. Passenger in 1A reassigned to 17F upon crew discretion. Lucien had approved it without hesitation, because he knew who the passenger was. And more importantly, he knew who the boy's father was. Harrison Brooks. The name still burned. Once upon a time, Lucien had worked inside a federal policy advisory board. He was brilliant, efficient, ruthless with numbers. But Harrison, already an established powerhouse in financial systems architecture, had sniffed him out like a dog sensing poison. "He's optimizing ethics for efficiency," Harrison had warned the board during a closed session. And that's a contradiction. Weeks later, Lucien had been quietly removed. No public scandal, no formal reprimand, just gone. And now, Harrison Brooks was untouchable, chairing oversight committees, building compliance protocols so powerful entire industries adjusted overnight. The man didn't scream justice. He built it into contracts. Lucien hadn't forgotten. And when he'd seen the seat map come through, Malcolm Brooks, 1A, unaccompanied minor, he hadn't needed to be told what to do. He'd simply pushed a nudge through the crew line, an override suggestion to Deborah's in-flight device, hidden behind standard discretion protocols. Move the boy. No confrontation, no drama. Just enough of a whisper to stir her instincts. He knew how people like Deborah operated. She wouldn't question it. She believed in order, and she believed she knew what didn't belong. He hadn't ordered her to discriminate. He'd simply given her the means. He didn't need to tell her who the boy was. He needed her to do what came naturally, and she had. Lucien took another sip of espresso. He tapped into the system dashboard again. The lockout still held. OmniPay had moved faster than expected, but that was part of the game. The exposure would force AstroJet's leadership to react. Legal would scramble, PR would stutter. In the crossfire, Lucien would reposition himself as the internal cleaner, the fixer who would rebuild trust. He'd already prepared the memo. Subject line: restoring ethical oversight in flight operations. In it, he'd distance himself from Deborah's decision while offering a full-spectrum reform plan, one that conveniently expanded his division's authority. Let the chaos burn the weak players. He'd emerge as the architect of order. He leaned back and exhaled. Then his screen blinked. An incoming call. Internal. Legal channel. Lucien narrowed his eyes and accepted. Celine Marshall's face appeared. Harrison's legal head. No pleasantries, no title greetings, only a single question. "Why did you approve the override?" Lucien's pulse ticked once. "Crew discretion is protected under policy," he said smoothly. "Not when it follows a targeted nudge from a higher access channel," Celine replied. Her tone wasn't angry. It was surgical. "You triggered a protocol flag," she continued. "And you used an outdated permissions key to mask it. But our team decrypted it 5 minutes ago." Lucien's screen flashed. A document appeared. Nudge origin. West, Lucien. Executive access. Timestamp 2:09 p.m. His expression froze. "You think I targeted him?" Lucien asked, feigning offense. "I don't need to think. I need to confirm motive." Celine leaned in. "You used a child to provoke a response, and you got one." Lucien said nothing. "I'd advise you to lawyer up," she said. "And if I were you, I'd start deleting any memos you've drafted calling for departmental expansion." She ended the call. Lucien stared at the blank screen. For the first time that day, he wasn't smiling. He reached for the photo on his desk, the chessboard, flipped it face down. Deborah Langston, thousands of feet in the air, unaware of the storm brewing below, was still patting herself on the back for keeping first class in order. She didn't know she'd been a pawn. Not yet. But she would. And when she did, she wouldn't just face the judgment of the passengers or the wrath of Malcolm's father. She'd realize the real betrayal came from inside the house she served for 2 decades. Captain Elliot Reeves had flown commercial jets for over 15 years. but nothing in his meticulously logged flight hours had prepared him for the call he was about to receive. It came not through dispatch, not through his crew, not even through the airline's internal comms. It came through the red line, rarely used, always encrypted, directly routed to executive leadership channels. The cockpit was still and dim, cabin lights set to boarding mode, passengers growing restless. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Dana Ruiz, was double-checking flight plans when the chime sounded. Captain Reeves glanced down at the display. Incoming call. Brooks, Harrison, Level Alpha. His brow furrowed. The name rang like a tuning fork in his mind. Harrison Brooks. Not a politician, not a CEO in the usual sense. More like an infrastructure overlord. The man who designed the invisible scaffolding behind compliance, finance, and security for half the aviation industry. The man whose reach was so vast, his influence was measured not in headlines, but in systems silently obeying. Reeves tapped accept. A voice came through, low and composed. Captain Reeves, this is Harrison Brooks. Yes, sir, Reeves said, already sitting straighter. My son is on your aircraft. Malcolm Brooks. The captain's eyes flicked to the manifest on the upper screen. Row 17F. Yes, sir. I have him listed. Is there a concern? There is, Harrison replied. He was reassigned from his paid seat in first class to the rear of the aircraft. Without cause, without policy justification. I am invoking immediate procedural investigation under Clause 9 Black. Reeves inhaled slowly. That clause was nuclear, embedded in executive oversight contracts for rare, high-level ethical breaches. I understand, Reeves said. I've already locked financial operations for AstroJet, Harrison continued. But now I'm requesting something from you, as captain. Reeves didn't interrupt. I want the crew member who made that decision identified and removed from duty. Not upon landing, now, while on the ground. Reeves didn't hesitate. Understood, sir. Anything else? Yes. Do not attempt to reassign Malcolm back to first class unless he asks for it. Do not use him as a symbol, a solution, or an apology. Do not make a show of redemption. The captain nodded, even though Harrison couldn't see him. Understood. Good. The line clicked off. Reeves exhaled slowly and turned to Lieutenant Ruiz. Deborah Langston. Where is she? Galley. She just finished service prep, Ruiz replied. Get her to the flight deck, now. 2 minutes later, Deborah stepped into the cockpit, clearly confused. Captain, everything all right? Reeves didn't offer a smile. Miss Langston, I've received a Level Alpha protocol call from executive oversight. A complaint has been filed regarding a possible breach of policy involving a minor passenger. Row 1A. Her expression tightened. I followed standard discretion. I'm not debating your rationale, Reeves said, his tone neutral. But per direct order, you are being removed from this flight, effective immediately. What? Ground crew will escort you off. You are to surrender your badge and access card to the gate manager. An internal review has already been initiated. Deborah's mouth opened, then closed. She looked stunned, less by the removal than by its precision. There was no argument, no appeal, just execution. She turned to Ruiz. Who filed the complaint? The boy's father, the co-pilot said quietly. Who the hell is his? Harrison Brooks, Reeves said, finishing for her. Deborah's knees nearly gave. She stumbled out without another word. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers, passengers checking their phones. Rumors about delays and payment errors had begun to swirl. Reeves emerged into the aisle, walking with purpose. He stopped beside seat 17F. Malcolm looked up. The captain crouched slightly to eye level. Mr. Brooks, he said gently, we're aware of what happened. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to personally offer— I'm fine, Malcolm said quietly. There was strength in his voice. Not defiance, not pride. Just certainty. I appreciate it, he added, but I'll stay here. The captain hesitated, then nodded respectfully. Understood. Passengers nearby watched in silence. This wasn't a boy sulking or seeking revenge. This was a young man choosing dignity on his own terms. Reeves returned to the cockpit. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then, the murmurs began. She turned him away? In first class? Did you see the captain's face? What kind of kid says no to going back? Malcolm didn't hear them. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, hands resting on his sketchbook. Not because he had nothing to say, but because they were finally listening. The screen on Captain Elliot Reeves's console blinked again, this time with a direct video link routed through executive authority. It wasn't common, and it wasn't optional. He glanced at Lieutenant Ruiz and tapped accept. The screen split into three. On the left, Reeves himself. In the center, Harrison Brooks, composed as ever, seated in a windowless room that hummed with digital power. On the right, Nathan Rudd, the current CEO of AstroJet Airlines, looking pale, even through the screen. His tie was slightly askew. Sweat glistened at his temple. "Captain Reeves," Harrison began, voice like polished steel. "Thank you for your discretion and for removing the crew member in question." Reeves gave a small nod. Nathan jumped in, voice tight. "Mr. Brooks, I want to personally apologize. This is not an apology call, Nathan," Harrison said. "This is a systems accountability call. There is a distinction." Nathan's mouth clicked shut. Harrison continued, tone unchanged. "Your team's initial reaction, firing the flight attendant, was a reflex, not justice. It was survival instinct." Rudd's cheeks flushed. "I understand, but please know, I've already ordered a full review." "You mean a containment report," Harrison corrected, "to control the media narrative." Nathan winced. Reeves remained silent, eyes flicking between the two men. "I told your predecessor," Harrison said, voice lowering just slightly. "And I warned your board 6 months ago when you took over. AstroJet has a cultural fault line running through its operations. Frontline decisions reflect executive values. What happened to my son is not an isolated incident. It is an algorithm executing itself through people." Reeves felt the temperature in the cockpit drop. Nathan cleared his throat. "We can adjust policy, training, add oversight." Harrison's next sentence stopped him cold. "You once sat in my lecture hall, Nathan." Rudd's eyes widened. Yes, Policy Design 302. Columbia. You were sharp," Harrison said. "But you lacked follow-through. That hasn't changed." It wasn't an insult. It was a verdict. The twist landed hard. The viewers, Reeves included, were now seeing layers they hadn't expected. This wasn't just a powerful father angry over mistreatment. This was a man speaking to a former student, now CEO, holding his professional failings up like a mirror. Nathan tried to gather himself. "Harrison, we're facing a financial lockdown. Your systems froze all our payment channels, every fuel truck, every vendor, every clearance. If we don't resolve this within the hour, we'll be functionally insolvent." "That's correct," Harrison replied calmly. "And I'm not asking you to beg. I'm asking you to listen." There was a pause. Then Harrison shifted gears. "Captain Reeves?" "Yes, sir." "You've remained neutral and professional. For that I thank you. But neutrality only works when the system is fair. Once bias infects procedure, neutrality becomes complicity. Do you understand?" Reeves nodded slowly. "I do now, sir. You'll ensure my son is left in peace for the remainder of the flight. No performative gestures, no corporate pageantry." "Of course," Nathan cut in. "What's it going to take to lift the freeze, Harrison?" "I'll comply with policy reviews, fire whoever needs to be fired. Just give me the conditions." "You're not in a position to bargain," Harrison said, still measured. "I don't want a deal. I want a precedent." "Then tell me what that looks like." Harrison leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers. "It looks like this. A full-page printed apology, signed by you, naming my son, not vaguely referring to an incident. It will appear in 3 major newspapers by sunrise tomorrow. Nathan's face paled further. And, Harrison added, you will create a $50 million fund, administered by the Equal Flight Foundation, providing access and opportunity to underrepresented communities in aviation, pilots, engineers, board members. That's insane, Nathan muttered. No, Harrison corrected. That's non-negotiable. Nathan looked trapped. My board will revolt. They can revolt while your airline bleeds cash by the second. I'll have legal draft the terms. Your clock started 7 minutes ago. The silence on the line was deafening. Captain Reeves swallowed hard. Even he, who had flown through storm systems and turbulence that cracked glass, felt unnerved. He was witnessing a quiet dismantling of power, and the man doing it didn't need to yell, didn't threaten, didn't bluff. Harrison Brooks simply laid down his terms, and the world bent around him. I'll call my board, Nathan finally croaked. You'll call them, Harrison agreed. And you'll remind them I warned you. The call ended. Reeves sat back in his seat. He looked at Lieutenant Ruiz, who'd been silently listening. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Who is this guy? Reeves shook his head slowly. The kind of man who doesn't speak often, because when he does, systems collapse. At the back of the plane, Malcolm remained silent, his sketchbook resting open on his lap. And though he didn't hear the call, the ripples were already spreading through the cockpit, the boardroom, and soon, the entire world. At 3:07 p.m. Eastern, while AstroJet's legal team scrambled to draft the apology Harrison Brooks demanded, a very different conversation was happening 2 floors below the executive suite, deep inside the Internal Integrity Division. It wasn't public, it wasn't recorded, and it wasn't routine. Celine Marshall, legal counsel for OmniFlow and personal liaison to Harrison, stood across from a glass wall, arms crossed, watching a terminal's encrypted audit scroll line by line. Beside her, the head of OmniFlow's digital forensics team muttered under his breath. 3 months' worth of anomalous permissions, all tied to the same executive key. The screen displayed a long alphanumeric code, but Celine already knew the name behind it. Lucian West. She didn't blink. Has it been confirmed? Yes. It's elegant, really elegant. The overrides are scattered, spaced out. Tiny pushes in internal systems, adjusted seating logs, shuffled crew memos, and small but precise adjustments to verification protocols. But it's consistent. And all trace back to Lucienne? Yes. She stepped back and exhaled through her nose. The weight of the moment settled into her bones. This wasn't an accident, she said. He wasn't reacting. He was engineering a trigger. Lucienne West, Director of Ops and Ethics Integration, a title that now read like a punchline. He wasn't just giving Deborah Langston a whisper in the dark. He had designed the entire moment, and Malcolm had been the pawn. A sacrificial token to provoke the one man Lucian wanted back in the game, Harrison Brooks. Celine remembered the rumors from years ago, how Lucian had once been poised to lead one of the country's regulatory divisions until Harrison blocked his appointment, publicly, then systematically, not out of personal vendetta, but because, in Harrison's words, Lucian designs for control, not balance. It had been the end of Lucien's federal ambitions, but apparently not his schemes. Celine turned to the forensic lead. Are you recording all of this? Off-grid, he said. We can't go through AstroJet's servers. He'd see it, but we have everything mirrored. Good. I want the report ready in 20 minutes. We'll deliver it directly. Deliver it to who? She looked at him, cold and unwavering. To the DOJ. Meanwhile, in his office, Lucienne West was watching a different screen. Not numbers. Footage. A paused frame from the captain's body cam feed inside the cockpit. The moment Harrison Brooks appeared on the secure channel. Lucienne had paused it mid-sentence. Harrison's face, sharp, unreadable, with the confidence of a man not seeking control, but restoring order. Lucienne's fingers hovered above the keyboard. He wasn't smiling anymore. He had thought this would force Harrison to re-enter the system, to expose his hand and play defense. He thought by triggering the claws, pushing the son, he could pull the father into the spotlight. But Harrison hadn't walked into a trap. He detonated one. Lucien turned to his desk where the outline of his proposal sat. Reform and Recovery Initiative. Expanding ethics oversight in aviation. His planned rise to internal power, built on the fire he'd started. It was now ash. He poured himself a scotch with shaking hands. Then his internal comms pinged. Executive meeting. Immediate attendance required. Lucien's mouth went dry. He didn't move. The second ping wasn't a request. It was a countdown. Back at the bridge, Carl Barrett, the operations supervisor, stood in a side room with an HR rep and a uniformed security officer. He held the preliminary report in his hand, the header in bold. Security breach originating from director-level clearance. The bullet points were clinical. Lucien had used high access permissions to bypass safeguards. He'd influenced flight seating. And he had likely done so to provoke legal exposure between AstroJet and Omniflow Holdings. Why? The HR rep asked. Why would he go this far? Carl shook his head slowly. Because if you're smart enough to design the system, you're arrogant enough to think you can control the explosion. The officer tapped his comms. Confirming readiness. We'll escort him to secure room B. Carl looked toward the glass where people were still scrambling to fix the damage. And for the first time all day, he felt something close to fear. Not because the airline was losing money, but because someone inside the heart of the company had tried to weaponize ethics itself. At JFK in seat 17F, Malcolm watched the light outside the window change as the afternoon sun slanted low. He didn't know the full scope of what was unraveling. He didn't know a high-ranking executive had used him to provoke his father, or that the man had failed. He only knew that no one had tried to move him again. No one had questioned his seat, his presence, or his right to stay still. For now, that was enough. But the real story was only beginning. And across the industry, a single question now echoed behind closed doors. If the quiet boy in 17F was the spark, who had tried to light the fire? The room was quiet, air thick with something heavier than tension. Regret, maybe, or perhaps the sharp stillness of clarity finally arriving after chaos. The terminal meeting space at JFK had been cleared. No reporters, no lawyers, no audience, just a table, 2 chairs, a glass wall that looked out over the tarmac. Malcolm sat on one side. His sketchbook rested on the table, unopened. Across from him, Deborah Langston entered the room slowly, shoulders pulled back but face unreadable. She wasn't in uniform. Her badge had already been surrendered, her name tag removed. Her lips were tight, her makeup faded at the corners, like she hadn't touched it since boarding. She took the seat across from him, back straight, hands folded in her lap. Malcolm didn't speak right away. He looked at her, his eyes not angry or timid, but simply steady, anchored by something unshakable. After a long moment, she cleared her throat. I was told this wasn't formal, she said. That it was your choice. I didn't expect that. It is my choice, Malcolm said quietly, and I'm not here to punish you. Deborah's eyes twitched. Then why? Because I think you deserve to know what it felt like, he replied. To be 13, to be dressed neat, to hold a ticket you were proud of, and to be told, without question, that you didn't belong. Deborah's gaze dropped. I didn't say that, she murmured. No, Malcolm said. But you didn't have to. Silence stretched again. Malcolm tapped the cover of his sketchbook gently. You didn't check my name, or my ticket. You just looked at me and pointed. Deborah looked up, her voice breaking slightly. I thought I was doing what was expected. Expected by who? He asked. That question landed heavy. She didn't answer. Instead, she nodded slowly. Her hand trembled just a little. I've worked for AstroJet for 24 years, she said. I've followed every protocol. I've de-escalated more fights than I can count. But when I saw you in 1A, something in me assumed." She stopped. Malcolm waited. "I assumed there was a mistake, and I wanted to correct it, fast, quiet, before anyone asked questions. I thought I was keeping order, but I wasn't. I was reinforcing it." "That's the thing about assumptions," Malcolm said. "They always feel normal to the person making them." Deborah blinked fast, trying not to cry. "I'm sorry." Malcolm looked down at his hands, then back up. "I forgive you," he said. The words were soft, sincere, no dramatics, no pause for effect, but powerful. "I forgive you," he repeated. "Not because I have to, but because that's mine to give. It doesn't undo what happened, but it frees me from carrying it." Deborah's hands flew to her face as a sob escaped before she could catch it. She looked away, ashamed, but Malcolm didn't move. He simply waited. After a minute, she composed herself and reached into her bag. "I was going to give this to your father," she said, sliding a folded envelope across the table. "But I think it's better you read it." Malcolm opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Not typed, not scripted. Written in blue ink, every word tilted slightly to the right. "Malcolm, you don't know me beyond the worst decision I've made. And I'm not writing to make excuses. I'm writing because for 24 years, I thought I was one of the good ones. Quietly fair, colorblind, professional. But fairness isn't silence, and colorblindness is just another way of not looking. You made me look, and what I saw was me, not doing enough, not questioning enough, not protecting kids like you from the rot that grows quietly behind smiles and uniforms. I'm leaving AstroJet. Not because they told me to, they didn't, but because I know I can't stay and pretend I wasn't part of the problem. I hope one day this letter matters to you, but mostly, I hope your future flights are uneventful, and that your seat is always yours. With regret and respect, Deborah Langston." Malcolm folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the back of his sketchbook. He looked up. Deborah was standing now, still not quite able to meet his eyes. "Thank you for the letter," he said. She nodded, tears still clinging to her lashes. As she turned to go, he added one more thing. "You were wrong that day, but you showed up today. That matters." She paused at the door. For a second, she looked like she might say something else, but she didn't. She just nodded again, and then she was gone. Malcolm sat there a while longer. Outside, planes landed and took off. Life moved forward. In his hand, the sketchbook felt heavier, but not burdensome. It held not just drawings now, but truth, and a piece of someone else's reckoning. Forgiveness, Malcolm knew, didn't erase damage, but it refused to carry it any further. And maybe that was the beginning of something better. By sunrise the next morning, #Clause 9. Black had trended across every major social media platform. On news networks, talking heads debated, speculated, and theorized over shaky footage from Flight 417, passenger interviews, and unofficial leaks from inside AstroJet's operations center. What began as a delayed flight had now turned into a corporate firestorm. The headline on the Washington Herald's front page was blunt: "AstroJet versus one passenger. Who really flew higher?" Below it was a photo of Malcolm, taken mid-walk down the terminal, backpack slung over one shoulder, sketchbook under his arm. He wasn't looking at the camera. He wasn't posing. He was just walking. The story had gone global. Financial channels broadcasted non-stop analysis of the meltdown. AstroJet stock had plummeted 40% in after-hours trading. Overnight, billions in market capitalization evaporated. The company's top 5 investors called emergency meetings. One hedge fund issued a public statement demanding immediate executive restructuring. But none of that hit harder than what happened at 8:12 a.m. In a breaking news alert, federal agents were seen escorting Lucian West out of his Dallas office in handcuffs. Cameras rolled. Reporters shouted. Lucian kept his head down, jaw tight, no longer in control of the narrative he thought he'd orchestrated. The Department of Justice had moved fast. By the time the sun had fully risen, he was charged with unauthorized manipulation of critical infrastructure systems, breach of federal compliance safeguards, intentional misuse of privileged access for retaliatory action, attempted coercion of a protected corporate entity in plain language. He'd weaponized the system for revenge. And the receipts, compiled by OmniFlow's legal and digital teams, were airtight. Nathan Rudd, the CEO, barely survived. Only after signing a public apology that ran full page in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the San Francisco Chronicle, naming Malcolm Brooks, stating the full details, and taking personal responsibility, did Harrison Brooks lift the freeze on AstroJet's payment systems. But the damage was irreversible. The apology, though masterfully written, did not soften the sting of betrayal in the eyes of the public. The company had humiliated a child, tried to bury it, and only acted when power demanded it. News outlets dug deeper into AstroJet's internal culture. Old complaints resurfaced. Past passengers spoke out. Former employees posted anonymously. A picture emerged. One of a company that had, for too long, treated order as synonymous with obedience, and disruption as anyone who didn't fit a silent mold. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict. AstroJet wasn't just liable, it was exposed. Meanwhile, in the offices of OmniFlow, Celine Marshall met with Harrison privately. The final reports had been submitted. The case against Lucien was now in the hands of federal prosecutors. "You made your point," Celine said, sipping her tea. And the industry heard it loud and clear. Harrison looked out the window. Across the skyline, planes took off. Business as usual. But for the first time in years, the term business as usual was being redefined. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just nodded once. "It's not about winning," he said. "It's about what they remember." They would remember, because Malcolm's story had become more than just a story. It was now a case study in ethics courses, a rallying cry for DEI initiatives, a blueprint for corporate accountability. Talk show hosts praised the boy's quiet composure. Parents across the country used the example to teach their kids about dignity. Teachers printed the apology and dissected its language in classrooms. Even flight attendants began whispering to each other, "Don't be a Deborah." But somewhere deeper, beyond the headlines and hashtags, people were asking harder questions about assumptions, about reflexes, about how a multi-billion-dollar enterprise could be brought to its knees by a single-seat reassignment. The answer? Because that seat, 1A, was never about luxury. It was about value. And the moment Malcolm was removed from it, the company revealed what they valued. Not policy, not passengers, but appearances. And that lie cost them everything. Malcolm, back in D.C., was home by then. He stayed out of the spotlight, refused interviews, declined podcast requests, politely ignored schools asking him to speak at assemblies. His father shielded him from the noise, from the headlines, from the praise. But the world kept spinning, with his name attached to change. At AstroJet HQ, the branding team had pulled every Fly with Integrity ad off the web. Billboards were replaced. Partnerships were paused. No new campaigns launched for weeks, because no matter how much money they threw at damage control, they couldn't outrun the stain. The brand would survive, yes, but it would never be the same. Because this wasn't just about bad PR. It was about what happens when the people with the most to lose forget who gives them the right to fly in the first place. And in that forgotten truth, a boy sat quietly, sketchbook in hand, never raising his voice, but teaching the world a lesson they wouldn't forget. The chamber was full. Senators, representatives, regulators, airline executives, press, and observers packed the grand hearing room inside the Capitol. Cameras lined the back wall. Flash bulbs clicked quietly. A row of nameplates sat on the polished mahogany table at the front. But the seat that drew the most attention wasn't even at the head of the room. It was the one in the second row, marked Reserved, M. Brooks. Malcolm sat there, in a navy blazer too big at the shoulders, hair freshly trimmed, hands folded over a worn leather sketchbook in his lap. He wasn't testifying. He didn't want to. He was here because his presence said more than any speech ever could. At the front, Harrison Brooks stood behind the podium, notes unread in front of him. He wasn't a man who spoke with flair. He spoke with precision. "Madam Chair, distinguished members of the committee," he began. "Thank you for allowing this hearing on the proposed Fly Fair Act, which would standardize anti-discrimination protocols across all U.S. commercial airlines." Cameras rolled. Pens scribbled. Behind him, Malcolm remained still. "This is not about one incident," Harrison continued. "This is about a pattern, about the gray areas of authority that allow bias to be cloaked in discretion and prejudice to be disguised as protocol." The room held its breath. "In recent weeks," he said, "the name Malcolm Brooks has appeared in hundreds of headlines, but my son is not a headline. He's not a symbol. He's not a case study." He paused. "He's a child who boarded a plane, sat in the seat we paid for, and was removed because someone believed they knew who belonged in that seat and who didn't." Murmurs. The senators looked down at their notes. Some looked uncomfortable. Harrison pressed forward. "We cannot regulate bias out of the human heart, but we can eliminate the policy loopholes that give it room to act without accountability." He lifted a small packet from the table. The Fly Fair Act proposes 4 things: body cam requirements for all in-flight crew interactions involving passenger relocations, third-party incident review boards, independent of airline HR departments, mandatory anti-bias training designed and delivered by civil rights organizations, not corporate vendors, legal consequences for discriminatory ejections, financial and professional. He set the packet down. "None of this should be controversial, but I know it is." He turned briefly, glancing at Malcolm. Just a flick of the eyes, a silent signal of gratitude. "And so," he said, "I leave you with this question. If a child can be quietly erased from first class, what else is being quietly erased in places without cameras, without names you recognize, without the power to fight back?" Silence. Then applause. Not loud, but respectful, rising slowly from the back rows where a coalition of civil rights leaders sat nodding. The chairwoman thanked him. Senators leaned into microphones to ask procedural questions. Airline lobbyists shuffled papers, but the air in the room had shifted. Harrison returned to his seat. Malcolm stood, walked up to the front of the room. No one stopped him. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a single page from his sketchbook. It showed a vast, intricate machine. Gears, pistons, belts, and cogs, all working in perfect rhythm. Except for one, a single misaligned gear, jammed sideways. The whole structure stalled because of it. He laid the page flat on the podium, then turned, walked back to his seat, and sat. The camera zoomed in on the sketch. No labels, no caption, just a message, quiet and clear. By the end of the week, the Fly Fair Act passed its first legislative hurdle with bipartisan support. Advocacy groups praised it. Airline stockholders protested. Editorials spilled onto op-ed pages like clockwork. But the public had made its decision, and their voice was louder than policy. The message was simple. Dignity was not a first-class luxury. It was a standard. Later that month, a civil rights gala was held in D.C. A new award was created, the Quiet Catalyst Honor, designed for individuals who created systemic change without needing to shout. The first recipient? Malcolm Brooks. He didn't attend, but his father did. When asked to say a few words, Harrison kept it short. "Sometimes," he said, "it doesn't take a movement, or a march, or a riot. Sometimes it takes a kid with a boarding pass, and a father who refused to let the world pretend nothing happened." The crowd stood, not to cheer, but to honor. In bedrooms across the country, kids began sketching things, not dreams of power or wealth, but of justice. Some drew Malcolm, some drew airplanes, some drew that broken gear, and taped it to their walls. Not because he was a hero, but because he was proof that change didn't always come with noise. Sometimes it walked down an aisle, quietly, and waited. The apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in not from absence, but from completion. From storms past. From truths said aloud, even if not shouted. Malcolm stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. The soft creak of the wooden floor beneath his sneakers greeted him like an old friend. Sunlight pooled on the carpet, filtered through half-closed blinds. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and paper. His father's preference for natural oils and print over anything artificial. The space wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Just 2 bedrooms. A kitchen with more books than appliances. A living room that doubled as an art studio. A hallway lined with framed documents, policy drafts, constitutional amendments, architectural blueprints of systems most people didn't know existed. But what grounded the space wasn't what it held. It was who returned to it. Malcolm set his backpack down by the door and kicked off his shoes, careful to line them up. "Hey," came a voice from the kitchen. Harrison stepped out, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired but warm. "Hey," Malcolm replied, dropping his gaze for a second, unsure of what to say now that it was all over. Or maybe just beginning. "You hungry?" his father asked. Malcolm shook his head. "Not yet." Harrison nodded, as if he expected that. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Instead, Harrison reached out and gently touched Malcolm's shoulder, a grounding gesture, like a lighthouse signaling to a ship, "You're home now." Malcolm walked past the living room, down the hallway, into his bedroom. Nothing had changed. The same posters on the wall, blueprints of planes, a framed sketch from when he was 9, a quote pinned above his desk that read, "Build better, always." He sat at the desk, opened the window just a crack. Let the city sounds drift in, distant and muffled, like background static to something bigger. Then he opened his sketchbook, the pages flipped under his fingers, each one holding pieces of him before the flight, before the transfer, before the world decided to look. He paused on the last page, the one he'd left blank. With slow, practiced hands, he pulled a pencil from the tin on the corner of the desk. It had been sharpened so many times it was almost a nub, but still usable. He began to draw, not furiously, not dramatically, just steadily. One line, then another, a gear, a bridge, a circuit, a face. The drawing didn't represent any one thing. It represented everything. The moment Deborah pointed, the silence of passengers, the hum of seat 17F, the calm in the cockpit, the fury behind a keyboard, the quiet dignity of saying, "I'll stay here." He didn't rush. He didn't need to, because the world had already moved. Now it was time to remember. In the living room, Harrison poured 2 glasses of water and placed one on the small table beside the couch. He didn't sit yet. Instead, he walked down the hall, paused at the doorway, watched his son draw. The boy wasn't shaking, wasn't frowning, just focused, whole. And that, more than any newspaper, any law, any freeze or fallout, was what mattered. He stepped inside quietly, pulled the second chair from the corner, and sat beside Malcolm. Said nothing. After a few moments, Malcolm looked up. They didn't exchange words. They didn't need to. But Harrison reached over and placed his hand gently on Malcolm's shoulder. Firm, reassuring, proud. They sat like that for a long while. 2 architects in different forms. One building systems with policy, the other with graphite and imagination. Eventually, Malcolm set the pencil down. Harrison looked at the sketch. It was unfinished, but clear. A network of gears, one tooth worn down, about to break. But instead of replacing it, another smaller gear had been inserted beside it, not to overpower, but to balance it. Harrison studied it, then looked at his son. "You didn't fix the machine," he said softly. "You made it work differently." Malcolm nodded. Then, with a small voice, asked, "Did I do enough?" Harrison didn't answer right away. He turned the sketchbook slightly, letting the light catch the lines, the shadows, the intention. Then, without turning, he said the words Malcolm didn't even know he needed. "You don't need to speak," he said in Vietnamese, the tongue he'd learned from his own mother long ago. "The whole world is already listening to you. You don't need to speak. The whole world is already listening." Malcolm's eyes filled, but he blinked the tears back, because he understood now. The power wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't in the courtroom or the contracts or even the crash of a company's stock. The power was in stillness, in presence, in refusing to move unless it was on your own terms. Outside, the city went on. Planes took off. Trains ran. People argued, debated, posted, shared. But in one small apartment, above it all, a boy sat beside his father, sketching, breathing, existing. And the world? It had changed. Because silence, when it comes from the right place at the right time, isn't absence, it's impact.